Good afternoon. This meeting of the Arizona Independent Redistricting Commission will now come to order. Today is Thursday, December 1st, and the time is 1:05 p.m. Let's begin with the Pledge of Allegiance. So let's start with roll call. Vice Chair Freeman, Vice Chair Herrera, Commissioner McNulty. Here. Commissioner Sturts.
Here.
We have a quorum. Unfortunately, Commissioner Herrera is ill today and so won't be joining us, but he'll be watching online and following along, as will Commissioner Freeman, who we announced yesterday is out this week due to some family circumstances and, of course, the birth of a new baby. So. They'll be, I'm sure, they'll both be following along or watching this when it's uploaded. Our next item on the agenda is number 2, discussion concerning process and schedule for adjusting draft maps to develop final maps. We've had this on the agenda the last 2 meetings and just wanted to raise it again in case there was anything new with regard to anyone's schedules or on the process that anyone wanted to raise. Sounds like everyone's okay with the process and the schedule as we've discussed.
Madam Chair?
Yes, Mr. Sturts?
May I offer a, two nights ago or 2 meetings ago, we had a very light presentation. In fact, it was just sort of a inclusion into the record of the House Memorial, as well as the joint document that came over from the Joint Legislative Redistricting Committee that came over from the Senate and the House. Would it be appropriate for us to invite someone to make a presentation on the...
Yes, I think that's great, and I'm asking Mr. Bladine to come up because I just heard from him right before this meeting that he just heard from someone in the legislature to possibly present that information. Mr. Bladine.
Madam Chair, Commissioner Sturts, I did have a call from the staff at the Senate, and Senator Biggs would like to come and present the report. I know he can't, he's not available on Monday. We're looking tentatively at Wednesday or whatever his schedule will allow.
Terrific. Thank
Great.
you.
And I think they'll be getting the schedule out for next week soon too, but it's, I think just from recollection, we're meeting one day, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. But we'll confirm that once the schedule does go out, because it hasn't yet. So, our next item on the agenda is discussion and possible direction to mapping consultant regarding adjustments to draft congressional districts. And of course, the next agenda item is on legislative districts. And we've been talking about different adjustments to both those maps all this week, and that will continue today. Our direction to the mapping consultant yesterday was primarily to focus on the voting rights districts on both of those maps, since we need to ensure those are sound, and if there are ways to strengthen them marginally around the edges, that always makes sense from a DOJ standpoint, as Mr. Adelson has told us. So they were given the direction to do so, and we'll have to see what they came up with overnight.
Okay. Have fully prepared some small changes to the 3 voting rights districts we talked about yesterday, districts 24 and 26, which are the weakest in terms of minority percentage, and District 4, which we were concerned could be improved on ability to elect. So I distributed to the commission and will make available online, I think as soon as the meeting's over, 3 change reports that'll serve as as kind of what we plan to supply for all the proposed changes, not just voting rights districts. Is there any preference of which district we start with?
Anyone have a preference?
If not, okay. If not, we'll just start with District 26. So let me open that one up. Okay, if you look at the change report, maybe it'd be helpful to go through that first, and then we can look at the map. Or I'll show you briefly where the changes occurred, and then we can look at the change report. Okay, so the main changes that happened in District 26 are there's an area in the southern boundary that we removed population from District 26. We didn't add anything to District 26. We just took a little bit of white non-crossover voters away. Those people were then put into District 18. District 18 started out a little high already, so with that change alone, District 18 was about 10,000 people overpopulated. To compensate for that, I balanced the population between 18 and 17. That 10,000 people would be probably within the range that legal counsel signified might be acceptable, but so that particular balancing isn't necessary, but it seemed to make 17 and 18 both about 5,000 people overpopulated. So I'll go in and just show you where those two changes are on the map, the streets that make up that area. So here on Dobson Road, we went up to, previously the border was just straight across Baseline Road. At Dobson, we went up to Southern Avenue, followed that west to McClintock, and then back down to Baseline. And I can show you the rationale there. And so that's in both Mesa and Tempe. If we remove the census place shading, you can see that that is one of the least Hispanic areas of the district. When we look at the performance, it was also not among the worst, but among the worst of the areas that has a low minority percentage. Then, continuing down, the change between 17 and 18 would be previously, the green line came across here, and I'm not sure what road that is. At Western. Then it went south at Santa Ana and then back over at Elliott. Then it went down here at Alma School until it hit Ray Road, at which point it went back down at Dobson. With the change, we've just kind of moved that over a little bit. Now it goes down farther at Dobson till it hits Warner. Then it goes down at Alma School, back over at Ray Road, following the original line. And that balanced about 5,000 people, as I said. So those are the two changes that we did to try to improve District 26. If we go to the change report, and then the report you guys all have, you can see just exactly how that worked. So starting with District 17, you can see that previously it was overpopulated by 381 people. following this change, it's now overpopulated by 5,695 people, a change of 5,314 people. You have it gained about 1,000 Hispanic population. It gained about 3,800 white population. When we look at the voting age, it gained about 672 Hispanic voting age population and about 3,000 voting age white population. Also, we've included now the CVAP. So those are estimates that I believe Ken has explained in the past to give the citizen voting age population and also the Hispanic percentage of registration. Those numbers are then again supplied for District 18, as that was affected also, and District 26, which is the district that we were, I guess, endeavoring to improve. So looking at District 26, you'll notice that when we look at voting age Hispanic population, it did lose 743 voting age Hispanics. However, since it lost 4,919 voting age non-Hispanic white voters, it was actually a net gain in the percentage of 0.71%. So, so everyone's clear, you can lose population, but as long as you lose that population relative to other segments of the population, it can be a net gain in total percentage. So in all, this change raised the HVAP of the district by 0.7%. And it raised the Hispanic percentage of registration 0.06%. Continuing on to the next page, I'm sorry if I didn't follow through on the screen, but considering on the next page, we can start with the splits. So the only thing this affected as far as the splits we're looking at is there is one fewer unsplit census tract. So we did split an additional census tract here. So from that criteria, it's slightly worse. Other than that, the rest of the map hasn't really changed, and none of these other splits have been affected. Continuing on to the competitiveness, you can see we have the numbers for all three districts, the four competitiveness indexes we've been using, and I'll just reiterate briefly what those are. Index 2 is an even weighting of the election results from 2008 and 2010. Index 3 is in 1/3 2008, 1/3 2010, and 1/3 voter registration. Index 4 is an even weighting of 2004, 2006, 2008, and 2010 election results. And Index 5 is those 4 years and 1/5 voter registration. You can see the mine inspector's race is here, and the reason that's included is because that is a proxy for ability to elect candidates of choice. So.
I just wanted to make a note. I think we need to disregard for the moment the registration line. There appears to be something wrong with that, and that showing the Democratic registration going up for all three portions of the split. So we will need to recheck the registration numbers and update that for you.
Would it also make sense to move the mine inspector out from under the competitiveness heading?
Okay.
I think it would make more sense to have that with a different heading, maybe.
That makes sense.
All right.
Seeing as it is more a voting rights measure.
Yeah. So we can move the mine inspector, the CVAP, and the Hispanic percent of registration to their own section.
That'd be good. Thank you.
I mean, the major takeaways from this, I guess, are that there are effects to the competitiveness of the districts. However, they're not major. Are there any questions about this report, how to read it, or
Madam Chair?
Mr. Sturts?
To our DOJ consultant and expert, have we done, when you're looking at, I guess my first question is while you're getting your mic together, for strategic telemetry. Can we get the numbers? Obviously, it stood out to me pretty clearly that the registration percentages, there's a flaw in your spreadsheet here somewhere. When will we get the update on these?
We can send that around tomorrow.
Okay, because that's going to be, it's like, how in the world could you have that big of a swing with that few people being moved? So we'll have that tomorrow?
Yes.
All right, thank you. And after your cursory review of this information, what's your reaction to it?
Excuse me, Commissioner Sturts, Madam Chair, just from a DOJ Section 5 perspective, in giving it a cursory review, I think that the numbers are more favorable from a Department of Justice standpoint in looking at the Hispanic population, the non-Hispanic Anglo population, the HVAP numbers. Just looking at it quickly, I think that, as we were talking about yesterday, this is a good trend, because from a Section 5 standpoint, the changes are beneficial. And this is not a situation where the numbers of minority voters, for example, are going down. So just from a very quick glance, the changes seem to me, from the Department of Justice's perspective, to be salutary.
And Madam Chair?
Mr. Sturts?
Were there, when you were, this is to strategic, when you were doing your analysis of locations, would you assume that there could be other blocks that you could have chosen from in a similar way and still get to this same net effect?
It's entirely possible that there's other blocks we could have gotten to the same effect. I did look at a couple different ways of doing this, and the approach I took seemed to make the most sense. I think this is a good example of how we're hoping you guys can use this information and consider these changes. That if you generally like the concept of the change, but you think it could be done slightly differently to accomplish the same goal, it's entirely possible to throw these out and start again. Or we can go over in session just kind of the rationale behind it. We can do that right now if you like, or I started with the Hispanic percentage and looked for areas to take it from. I also looked at the mine inspector's race so that I was not removing strong crossover voters. And then as far as the population balancing between 17 and 18, I ideally tried to get rid of, I started with trying to get rid of this little loop right here, just to improve the compactness slightly. And then I was kind of torn between using the block groups that comprise the center of this to make it more of a smoother line, but then I wasn't sure if it would be better to go with kind of the main roads that everyone knows. So you have district boundaries that are more on main thoroughfares, and that's the type of the input that I would love and welcome greatly. So that was kind of my process, and there's undoubtedly ways to do this that could be better. So this is not the way it has to be if this is something you want to do.
And Madam Chair?
Mr. Sturts?
As a follow-up to that, goes back to the discussion yesterday, is that if there are other ways to be able to achieve this goal that are not going to, that we're going to be able to interlace the other criteria where we're not necessarily breaking up neighborhoods and geographical features, et cetera, to come into play. These were, and by no means are you saying that these are arbitrary. These were specific based on statistical analysis.
Yeah.
And that, so Madam Chair, maybe this is the question I should ask. What are your expectations from this commission to be able to deliver to you, to assist you to move this ball down the field?
Consensus.
Well, I'm speaking about, so it sounds to me like that there are a couple of different ways to achieve the goal. That the goal from our DOJ consultant's perspective is a good one, and that we're moving in the right direction. That I'm still hoping that we're going to be able to use the baseline numbers that we currently have and to reference back to those. And sometime I'm hoping that by our first meeting on Monday that we sort of have that baseline checklist and we can go, okay, if we've got one that's hitting this, because I'm still a little concerned on the legislative side that we have moved a below 50% from Pima County or from southern Arizona to a below 50% up in Maricopa County, and I want to have some discussion about that and how we're going to react to that as an answer. And I don't know what that answer is going to be yet, but I'm going to guess that that may be a question that DOJ would come up with. And that as we start to look at the other criteria in the constitutional criteria that we're mandated to follow, how we can assist strategic telemetry in making these adjustments that appear to be going in this direction.
And I think when we look at the changes, District 24, there are cases where you can see there's an obvious, swap, perhaps when you just look at one of the criteria, perhaps like the minority percentage or the mine inspector's race, but when you consider municipal boundaries, it makes it a little bit of a tougher call. So I erred on not splitting up an extra municipal boundary and stuff. So yes.
Madam Chair?
Mr. Sturts?
It may be helpful that during this study break time that we've got tomorrow through Sunday, that we would be able to have this data, as you now have it crafted, available to us, drop it onto our laptops before we depart today.
Absolutely. And we are ready to do that. And the block equivalency files for this will go up on the website as soon as possible with these reports so that members of the public can also evaluate these possible changes as you evaluate them.
Very good. Thank you.
Madam Chair, if I could, just as to pick up on what Commissioner Sturts is saying, or his comments, and also regarding the changes as a whole, it's important as we proceed to document why certain changes were made, considered, not considered, because as the working map is revised and altered, and then moving forward to adoption, the department will want to see specifically why certain changes were made, what were the rationales for them, and why certain changes, if they were considered, were not made. So that's a very important part of the overall submission from a documentation standpoint.
Thank you. Any other comments on this?
It appeared to me that what you moved today is a little different from what you were picking out yesterday.
Yeah, I kind of scaled back the changes yesterday a little bit. We had initially talked about taking this area right here. When I did that, it was actually a net loss on the Hispanic percentage. It was ever so slight, but since it couldn't really be justified as increasing the HVAP, I didn't do that. So I think the changes that we're doing today are perhaps a little bit more modest than what we looked at yesterday, and we could expand on them at any point if we're free to change anything we want. So
I like the idea of having the material to take a closer look at, because it's going to be hard without the benefit of at least a snapshot of the geography to fully understand what we're working with here.
So if there's not any more questions on district, and just one other thing, just to clarify too, the population balancing between districts 17 and 18 is not a voting rights concern there, because those are not majority districts. So in that case, I was simply trying to improve compactness as one of the measures, and as you see, it's an area that's wholly contained in Chandler, so that it wasn't going to create an additional municipal split or anything like that. So if possible, it'd be nice to remove a split, but it wasn't like that big of a change to make. So with that, I'll go to District 26, or 24, excuse me. You have a similar report for that also. All right, so there were two changes in District 24 as well. One of them was to make District 23 take a little bit from 24 in the Scottsdale area. The other was to have 28 take a little bit from 24 in the Phoenix area. The changes there were meant to reflect, areas that had a lower. Okay, and yeah, there is a small typo at the top here. It says VRA 26. That should have been 24. And the title is correct. When you look at the new map, it has the wrong title. And I'm sorry, we're still trying to work out some of the kinks on this. And yes. So the districts affected were 23, 24, and 28. Starting with the changes here to the Phoenix area between District 28 and 24. As you can see, these are some of the have some of the highest non-Hispanic white population. So they were obvious places to grab on that front, and also the numbers here represent how the Hispanic candidate did in the mine inspector's race. So they were a combination of both being highly white and also low performing as an ability to elect. There's other areas that are a similar percentage white, but much higher on an ability to elect. So that's why I made these choices. The change is that this line used to run across here from 24th Street over to .36. It ran across at Camelback. It goes down south slightly further now and runs across at Campbell Avenue, between there. The other change took place between District 23 and District 24, and that's in the Scottsdale area. Again, these are areas that have a low minority percentage of total voters, and also a relatively low support for the Hispanic candidate in the mine inspector's race. There was this block right here, also fit the bill. It has a very low minority percentage and also wasn't very supportive of the mine inspector. The reason I did not do that, add that to District 28, would be because to do so would add another split of Scottsdale. And to add it to 23 would kind of negatively impact the compactness and the shape of the district. So those are the considerations that I was using. That's something that we have to follow, but I was kind of looking for the low-hanging fruit, I guess, so to speak, of how to improve these maps. So those are the two changes to District 24. Again, there was no population added, just removing white population to try to increase the minority percentage to better comply with the Voter Rights Act. Put the change report up again so that the members of the audience can see that. So District 23 started underpopulated. By taking from District 24, it actually gets a little closer to the ideal population size, but it is still underpopulated. So District 23 could still stand to gain more population. District 24 started about 500 people overpopulated, and it dropped to about 7,400 people underpopulated. Again, that's the voter rights district. When we look at the Hispanic percentage, it went from 38.57% total Hispanic population to 39.58. The non-Hispanic white percentage dropped from 46.35 down to 45.05, a change of about 1.3%. looking at the voting age, non-Hispanic white, it dropped by 1.21%, and the HFAP went up by almost 0.9%. So again, these are small changes, but they do increase. A percentage point is not insignificant. I guess the important thing from a voter rights perspective would be to make sure that the mine inspector race and the other sort of voting rights elections that we're going to use, which will also be included in subsequent drafts, aren't negatively harmed by these changes. When we look at how District 24 did in the mine inspector's race, previously the Democratic candidate would have received 58.7% of the vote. After these changes, that goes up to 59.7%. So it is an improvement. District 23 started out using just index 2 at 62.4% Republican. It did drop a little bit to 62.1%. And then District 28, kind of the same thing. Are there any questions about this? Oh, also looking at the splits, there was one fewer census block group that is not split. So it was a slight improvement there.
Any questions on 24?
Madam Chair, Mr. Desmond, did you have a chance to look at the material we received in the Scottsdale hearing?
From Susan
Gerard?
I did. Wasn't quite ready to produce the report, although we do have those maps ready
Okay,
to look at.
I'd like to look at that in conjunction with this whole analysis
Okay.
also.
There's two ways we could do that right now.
You don't need to do it right now.
Oh, okay.
I'd like you to consider that material.
Okay. Okay. So are there other questions about this? Okay. Well, then the other one we have prepared for today is changes to Legislative District 4. That's the district that goes through southern Yuma and comes up into the western portion of Maricopa County. Also includes the Tohono Nation.
While you're pulling that up, I should also recognize the other members of our team, and I forgot to do that when we did after we did roll call. We have legal counsel with us today, of course, Bruce Adelson, Joe Canefield, and Mary O'Grady, our mapping consultant, Willie Desmond, and Ken Strasma. We have staff in the room, Chief Technology Officer Buck Forst, Ray Bladine, who's our Executive Director, and our Deputy Executive Director, Christina Gomez, is here, and I believe Lisa Schmelling, our Public Outreach Coordinator, and Stu Robinson, our Public Information Officer, and then we have our trustee court reporter, Marty Herder, who will be is taking a transcript of today's proceedings.
All right, District 4 is a district runs along the southwest border. Looking at it, starting in the Tucson area, there wasn't any real obvious places to grab minority population because it does border voting rights districts in districts 2 and 3. So, and then the area kind of by Picture Rocks and Marina and stuff, there wasn't any real good population to grab that would have improved it. I'll turn on the block group. Oh, and this is shaded differently now. Okay, so there was no real strong areas following in District 11 to pick up minority population. So continuing along, I went up into Maricopa County and found kind of the same thing. It runs along District 19, which is one of our voting rights districts, and then on the north side, District 13 does not have much to offer by way of minority population or strong support for the mine inspector's race. So really we're left with the possibility of removing population is the only method. Again, because in Tucson area we didn't want to remove any of the reservation area. We wanted to keep that whole. That was not a very good option. There is the town of 3 Points here. We didn't want to split another boundary, so I left that and found kind of the same thing in Maricopa. So what we're left with is really trying to improve it in Yuma. So that's where I proceeded. District 4 did not gain any population, similar to the other two. Instead, it really just shed some of its whiter areas. In this case, since District 4 already started with a fairly strong voting age Hispanic percentage, it wasn't as much of a consideration to try to increase that. What we were really aiming to do here was to improve the ability to elect. So the consideration that kind of trumped the racial makeup of the areas was the performance. And again, I used mine inspector here, but when we're looking at other races, certainly when we verify and make sure these changes are good, and they'll be included in the reports. But you can see, again, the numbers are, I'll make those a little bigger. Are how the Hispanic candidate performed in the mine inspector's race. So by and large, these areas were very low performing, and that's why they were removed. District 4 started slightly overpopulated, so it did have quite a bit of population to shed. District 13, where the population was transferred to, started about 600 people underpopulated, so it had population to gain, I guess. So. We moved about 8,000 people, 8,622 people from District 4 to District 13. And by doing so, we were able to, District 4 went from a HVAP of 53.65 up to 54.46. So it did improve there. And also we were able to bring the mine inspector race from 51% up to 52%. So it gained about a point there. If you're curious, I'll turn on the streets here. So you can kind of see where these changes are. So it used to run, went down Elgar, and then, they're not all labeled. Palo Verde, back up at Pacific, then on 26th Place. What we did is just kind of take it straight across at 24th Street, and then down here at, I think that's First Avenue, kind of around, following the census block groups. One other thing that was affected by this is there are two fewer unsplit districts or census tracts and 5 fewer unsplit census block groups. So it did improve on our splits report also. Are there specific questions?
Madam Chair, I have one question for legal counsel. As we're looking at these things, we've gone in District 13 from a deviation from ideal population of 594 to 8,000. And so that now we have a almost 4% deviation in population in District 13, which is not a voting rights district. How are we best to document, you know, if we did this, that the reason for that population deviation was based on what we just did in a voting rights district, so that we have a, you know, a good record to explain that deviation?
Commissioners, I'll take the first chance and then people can supplement. I think that this change order form does help provide that documentation if the change is made in the context of this change, so I think you are making that record. But in addition to that, I think it makes sense to, since this change was made for a specific purpose, to include the voting rights district, probably as perhaps a later step, looking at all the population deviations and make sure they can be justified, because it may be that there's a way to lower that number when you look at the map as a whole.
Okay.
And so at some point that needs to be done so that all the changes really are justified map-wide.
Well, at this point, we just have such a huge amount of documentation and data that I guess my question is, can we track this in some way so that, I guess we'll look back at these change orders and we'll know the districts that we've altered in conjunction with altering the voting rights districts. And okay.
Yeah, that's why I think the change orders will help a lot.
Okay.
Madam Chair, Commissioner McNulty, we agree, we concur with Mary that that's the appropriate way to document these changes through the change order and through this testimony here. And we, of course, will keep track of this for the final submission to draw attention to the reasons that this change was being made was to help strengthen a majority-minority district, which resulted in a population deviation in a non-majority district. So.
Madam Chair, if I could ask a question with the change order, please. Willie, on the second page, in looking at the mine inspector race with the Index 2, Index 3, Index 4, and 5, I was just curious why Index 4 shows a different result in the mine inspector race, Republican, Democrat, compared to the other three indexes. Why would there be one difference?
I'm sorry, could you clarify the question? What's the difference here?
Sure. In looking on page 2 for the mine inspector for District 4, under Index 2, Index 3, and Index 5, the Democratic candidate won, but under Index 4, the Republican candidate won. I was just curious why one result would be different than the other three.
Thank you for that clarification. Index 4 includes results from 2004, 2006, 2008, and 2010, but not registration. The big difference is the 2004 result, which includes Senator McCain's reelection in 2004 by a lopsided roughly 70-30 margin. That's evened out in Index 5, which is all 4 election years plus registration. So that's why Index 4 is generally the lowest percent Republican.
Thank you. And just so I understand, the 4 indexes don't represent the results of the mine inspector. They're an aggregation of election returns for this draft district?
That's correct. They're a reaggregation of past election results to the new lines, so how the district would have performed if it had existed under those elections. And just to recap, jump in here if I'm remembering wrongly, but Index 2 is the average of the results from the statewide partisan races from 08 and 2010. Index 3 is 08, 2010, and partisan registration. Index 4 is 2004, 2006, 2008, and 2010, averaged together each year, weighted equally. And Index 5 is the 4 years plus partisan registration.
Thank you.
And then if I could just add, No, that's right, when you're done. And we're going to move the mining inspector data up to the minority voting population chart. So it'll be with CVAP and Hispanic percentage of registration.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, any other questions on these or comments on these legislative districts? Mr. Sturts?
As a follow-up to Mr. Adelson's, it's probably be prudent for a republication of the inclusions of the indices with the specificity of what races were and were not included, just to make sure that we can revisit those. It's been 45 days since we've looked at these, and since that time, the 0406 was included. Prior to that, the 0406 was not. So when the draft maps were approved, the indices of 4 and 5 were not taken into consideration. So it would be good to one, have the information about what is included, what races are included, and have we done a indices 4 and 5 analysis on the current draft maps?
Yes, we have, Commissioner. We can get that.
Has that been distributed?
Yeah, that was distributed at the time we released the 0406.
Oh, it's in that packet with the 04. All right, thank you.
Thank you for the suggestions. We will we'll add a footnote explaining the indexes to this document, and also I would welcome any suggestions about different weightings. I know there's considerable discussion among the commissioners about how different election years and races should be weighted. We only generated a straight average of the different races. I know there were some people who discussed weighting, more recent years more heavily, weighting closer elections more heavily. Anything along those lines that a commissioner would want to suggest, we'd be happy to explore.
I know that there was certain races for you pointed out the 04 McCain race, which was a heavily lopsided victory. And there might be a couple others, but we'll take a look at those as soon as you republish that information. Thank you.
Any other comments on the 3 legislative districts we just discussed? Okay, well, the analysis bore out what you guys kind of suggested yesterday, that it's a game of inches and there's really not huge amounts of advantage to be gained, but Mr. Adelson has suggested that even these 1/10 of a percentage point increments make a difference from DOJ's standpoint, so they're definitely worth considering, and whether we do these particular ones or not, we'll have to decide as a commission, or if there's any other ones that people want to explore for these 3 districts. I was kind of wondering if it's possible to, once we do decide on any of these adjustments to the voting rights districts, as a commission, and once we agree that these, we like the lines the way they are, we've sufficiently improved them in a way that improves the ability for a candidate to, a voter to elect the candidate of their choice. Can we lock in those voting rights districts and then deal with the rest of the map, or is that not something you can do from a process standpoint? I'm curious from legal counsel what your thoughts are on all that.
Madam Chair, and I guess it's both a lawyer question and a mapping question, so you might want to hear from both of us on those issues. But I think procedurally, you're certainly welcome to take whatever approach you want to take, and if you want to lock those in before you do the rest of the map, I think you could. You might want to leave yourself some flexibility because of, particularly with the congressional, on the need for the precise population figures map-wide. But yeah, you certainly can try and close these out from a legal perspective.
And the
And
reason.
that also helps provide some time to do the analysis. So you
Exactly.
might want to also leave yourself some flexibility, not just for technical changes, but also for any tweaks that the analysis suggests might be helpful. Although, as we've seen, there's not a lot of movement, not a lot of gains to be had there. I don't know anything else from a legal perspective, and then maybe, I don't know if Ken has some mapping considerations.
Madam Chair, the only thing we would add is that, I mean, we agreed that might suggest that the commission consider doing that and locking the districts in, but subject to analysis and subject to change when following the analysis, because the analysis itself could take 2-3 weeks. And while that's being undertaken, then the commission could focus on the other districts and then come back with Professor King and Mr. Strasma's team's analysis too, and then go from there. That might be the best approach. Bruce?
Madam Chair and members of the commission, and I agree with that. I think that to the extent that you can reserve, lock in the majority-minority districts pending additional analysis, I think that that's a good way to go. There, as we've been discussing, there clearly could be additional changes, but from a Section 5 standpoint, the department is going to be looking at those 10 districts. So I think we agree to the extent that you can do that, with the caveat being pending additional analysis that will be necessary to confirm whatever our thoughts are. Thank you.
Thank you. Do you have any comments, Mr. Strassman?
I just wanted to second what legal counsel had said. It will certainly help in terms of the analysis if we know there's 90% likelihood that these will be the final districts. We could begin the analysis and get a leg up on that.
And that was my only reason for suggesting locking these in, is just so that the analysis can then get started, and then if we have to roll back any changes or make additional ones because of the analysis, we can. But it just seems like the analysis takes a long time, and we want to do it right. So to the extent we can get those nailed down, we should first. Ms. McNulty?
And as I understand it, you told us way at the back that the analysis was going to be an ongoing process, and we did analysis all along. We're doing analysis now, and what we're really talking about is final analysis. In order for us to bring closure to the analysis for purpose of submission, we need to bring closure to the extent we can, and subject to the ongoing analysis, to our districts.
Commissioner McNulty and Madam Chair, I mean, I think that's a good way to look at it, that analysis is ongoing, and as far as additional analysis that's needed, the analysis would be to answer the questions that we've been talking about, to confirm what our thoughts are, what our presumptions are. Then if we have confirmation and we can start making the checks to say, okay, this is good, this is good, this is good, that satisfies the standards, yes, that's, I think, where what we're pointing towards and where the analysis is heading. Now, that's certainly a lot different than 3 or 4 months ago when you're starting from the beginning. But now with what's on the table with the working map, the analysis is all designed to confirm theories, answer questions that are necessary for the submission. Yes.
So on the legislative map, are there other things we want to talk about in terms of other districts with regard to majority-minority districts?
Madam Chair, I wondered if Willie and Ken had a chance to look at Legislative District 2.
Yes, a little bit, and I can show you where we are with that.
Okay, just kind of a status update.
No problem.
I'm concerned about that. I don't want to dilute the effectiveness of that district in a way that jeopardizes pre-clearance. So I want to put that probably on our priority list of potentially infirm districts that we need to make sure we have addressed.
So, just to give a little background on what this is not, this green line is not the draft map as it was approved. This is, assuming that we took those changes where the Cochise County section was clipped out and Green Valley was put into that to balance the population and keep the I-19 corridor whole. What are ways that we could minimize the negative effect on District 2, which is a voting rights district? I guess there are two considerations when we're evaluating whether or not this is a change to make. One is it something that we want to do just based off of public comment and the constitutional criteria? And the other is how much does this hurt the voting rights district? Does it still, is it still strong enough that it would likely pass pre-clearance? So what this attempted to do was just look for some areas that we could perhaps increase the Hispanic percentage back up where possible.
Mr. Desmond, before we get there, what are we comparing this against in terms of a benchmark? I know there's no straightforward answer to that, but can you give us any help?
Commissioner McNulty, Madam Chair, one way to look at it is, I've been looking at the chart of the current legislative districts and going down the chart to see, for example, which district has the lowest amount of Hispanic voting age population, which district has the lowest amount of minority voting age population. In the current districts, for example, District 23 has a 48% minority population. So one thing I'm looking at is, are there any districts in the working map that are less than that? Whether there are or are not by itself doesn't necessarily mean that that's a problem. But then continuing to look at the HVAP, the overall Hispanic population, in District 23, for example, the Hispanic percentage of total VAP is 28.7%, which is relatively low. I don't think in any of the working maps, majority-minority districts, the percentage is that low. So that's a very important distinction in comparing this to the benchmark. One, there are two basic ways that DOJ will look at this. DOJ will look at the geographic equivalent, if there is one, of the draft District 2. If there is no geographic equivalent, then DOJ will look at the numbers across the whole plan, because retrogression is measured across the state. So if, for example, there is one less district in a geographic area than there was under the benchmark, then DOJ will look to see where is that being compensated for. So that's an example. I know that doesn't get to your whole question, but that's one thing that I'm doing with, as we're discussing, is I just keep looking at the percentages, which I'll keep doing, to see are we below any significant percentage in the benchmark. And if we are, then that's something that we'll need to address. But as far as geographic equivalent, I don't know whether there's been any discussion of what this would be the equivalent for under the benchmark. Yeah.
And to that point, this is basically 44% of LD2 is Old 29, which was a voting rights district. 36.8% is Old 25. It is stronger, even with this change, than Old 25. And I think the numbers say it's not as strong as Old 29. So it's kind of in the middle of the two that voting rights district that primarily comprise this new area based on the preliminary analysis. So that might be okay. I mean, we have a case to present there that we have improved on Old 25 and by bringing these communities together. So and then analytically, looking at the statewide comparison to make sure that we are, as Bruce described, the same or better statewide as well. So I don't know if that answers your question. So in terms of whether this is good enough, this might be one that if there is a consensus that they're interested in doing this particular change, that perhaps we get started with that deeper analysis of this particular change, even while the rest of the map is in flux, if they'd like us to do that. I mean, this is worse than the draft map, if that's the question. This is weaker than the draft map. But it has a mixed results in terms of the benchmark. And then we're documenting the reasons for the change. It's not to weaken it from a voting rights perspective. It's to deal with the public input as far as keeping Cochise County whole, which included public input from former Hispanic representatives from that area, and the I-19 public testimony about those communities of interest, which are all legitimate, traditional, redistricting criteria. So as long as we document our reasons and do the deeper analysis, and perhaps you want us to go forward with that deeper analysis, which is really just looking at more elections for that area.
Madam Chair, I would really support that because, and I think it is very important to be clear that we would not be making this change to weaken the effectiveness of voting rights in this area. We got comments from Hispanic people in Bisbee and Douglas who prefer to have their legislative district be with the surrounding communities. And we also got comment before we started considering this, that this district might be packed too much. So what we're trying to do is achieve a good balance here in the context of a lot of community comment and legitimate, real legitimate, I think, community of interest kinds of issues.
And in terms of public comment, that was the other public comment in terms of the Tucson. There was testimony in Tucson about whether this was packed, whether this was too high.
Commissioner McNulty and Madam Chair, I want to follow up on what Ms. O'Grady said, and this is really a great example of looking at this from the Department of Justice's standpoint. As you know, there are two types of retrogression, essentially intentional discrimination and accidental discrimination. Putting on the record, as you've done, that this is not being anticipated to intentionally discriminate is very important, because there are many jurisdictions around the country who do the opposite. And there is a public record that says, no, we're doing this to discriminate. So it's very important to do just exactly what you have said and what has been explained to document that. On the other hand, as far as accidental discrimination, the analysis that Ms. O'Grady talked about is essential to show there isn't any. So if the analysis can show that there's no accidental discrimination, that this was not being done to discriminate intentionally, and it was done in response to public comments, assuming then that everything looks good with the analysis and that it measures up with the benchmark, that's a good template of how to approach looking at the majority-minority districts from a submission standpoint, because that's exactly what the department will want to see. That's something to highlight in the submission to explain why the change was made, so they can look at the narrative and see, oh, okay, now we understand that this was done in response to public comment. Here's the analysis to show that there is no accidental discrimination. They do their own analysis. If it confirms that, and all other things being equal, then they move on. So that's really essential to do, just as you have said today, that this is being anticipated not to discriminate, not to discriminate against minorities. That's very important. That's something that is often lacking in the record in other jurisdictions around the country. Thank you.
Madam Chair?
Mr. Sturts?
To explore something again that I'd mentioned earlier about that currently doesn't really appear to have a lot of contemplation in the record, is the relocation of the majority-minority district from southern Arizona to Maricopa County. How would you perceive us, or how would you make recommendations for us to be addressing that? And that one of those is one of our under 50% population benchmarks.
Thank you, Commissioner Sturts. Madam Chair, that's a great point, that as far as moving forward, In documenting any changes geographically, for example, compared to the benchmark, and explaining that as a function of population growth and population change, and that these changes were not made to discriminate against minorities is very important. And in moving forward and getting to the point of adoption, and then beyond that submission, yes, having material like that in the record is very important. That goes along with a narrative description of why certain changes were made, with a indication of census data and population change to support what changes have been adopted.
Mr. Sturts?
How would you recommend we building that at this point?
Commissioner Sturts, Madam Chair, I think that as is moving forward with one example being what Commissioner McNulty was talking about earlier, as you go from district to district, if there are districts that you're looking at or reviewing and can explain the Commission's rationale in making the initial draft working map, and then whatever alterations are done to that, explaining why they're being done, is important, because that would be something that can be highlighted in the submission with specific references to a transcript, or also taking quotations out of a transcript to explain why certain changes were made to demonstrate the absence of discrimination.
Yeah, in terms of the pre-draft record that we have, we started with these three because we picked the alternative based on the alternative plans that were available, and the other had 2 Southern Arizona districts, so we picked the one with the most, which was 3. This map, and then we also did the same in Maricopa, trying to, look at the alternative plans available and see where they had the most viable minority districts. And so we have that record developed already in terms of the alternatives that we've selected that favor compliance with the Voting Rights Act. And as Bruce said, just continuing to build from that, I think, will be helpful.
So where do we go from here? Ms. McNulty, you would like this looked into further, you mentioned, right? The whole change with Cochise County.
I really like the idea of doing the further analysis. What I'm hearing from Ms. O'Grady and Mr. Canfield and Mr. Adelson is that this doesn't jump out at them as something that's not workable, that it might achieve a good balance between where we were before, which was a potentially ineffective district down here in that part of the state, and a potentially overpacked draft district, and that it's worth looking at in more detail. If what they were telling us was, no, this just, you've crossed a line here and this is too weak, and we recommend out and out that you retain the border communities in the district, then that's what I would want to do. But I hear them saying that this may be just fine and it's worth doing the further analysis. Is that a fair?
Commissioner McNulty, Madam Chair, I think that your description really is right on point, because let's assume that the alterations that you've been discussing are looked at, and let's assume that the alterations are problematic from a Section 5 standpoint. There's really nothing better from a Department of Justice perspective in looking at the submission to see they considered A, to see how it would work. They found that it would discriminate and would retrogress. They abandoned that and went in the other direction. I mean, that is a very clear record of non-discrimination, which the department will want to see. So I think looking at it in that perspective really works very well from Justice's standpoint of analyzing the submission under Section 5.
And it is a situation where it's not something that has a lot of ripple effects for other districts, because we can just go back to what we've done here. I think we could, if we need to, we can improve the area that extends into Cochise County, because there's some areas there that, well, like we heard that testimony from the folks who live in the Huachucas that wouldn't need to be there from a voting rights perspective at all. But other than that, it would be a fairly straightforward exchange if we needed to go back to that.
Mr. Desmond, can you pull up the draft map just with that so that both are on the screen? Just, I want to see. I assume the only change that was made there was the tail.
So let me go back to the draft map, add that also. Okay, so this was the draft map. And as you can see, there is the arm that sticks out into Cochise County, and also this area right here of Green Valley. So when we removed this population from District 2, we gained population by including Green Valley. And then the only thing, so that was something we kind of looked at yesterday as an example of the changes we could look at. That wasn't, we haven't presented that yet. But then I also explored in here just a little bit areas to add some more Hispanic population back into District 2 to kind of minimize the hit it takes. And there's some small tweaks around the edges, although I didn't get a chance to fully explore it, and I haven't. I'm not sure if this is a work in progress, I guess, essentially. But there are some border areas that have relatively high Hispanic population from District 10. But it's something I'd like to look at more before we present anything. Just speaking from a practical sense about considering these changes and stuff like this, what I think it'd be very good to avoid would be to have two sets of maps, one that has this change and one doesn't. So if it's something that we need to decide if it's practical or not, maybe that's something that we could work on, and Ken could probably offer some insight. But then if we accept the change, that would be the new baseline, so that in the future, any other change that you're looking at would be based off of that map. So we're always kind of evolving. If it needs to evolve to grow a tail again, we can always do that. But it wouldn't be going back to the draft map. It would be changing the working map to look more like the draft map. And that's the kind of process that I think we need to use going forward. And also, Buck, can I get batteries? My mic's about to die.
To expand on what Mr. Desmond said, I think what I'd like to suggest is that we look at the change as it is up here, just without any of the other tweaks over the course of the weekend, and see if we can get to the point, working with Mr. Adelson and the rest of the legal counsel, where we can give this probably looks good, so we can freeze it for the more in-depth analysis, or we need to work harder by Monday, and with hopes of Monday making a decision and moving forward in either direction.
Sounds good to me.
Do you agree, Mr. Sturts?
Yeah, Madam Chair, I think a couple of things. One, it would be terrific for us to establish what our benchmarks are, what they have been, so that we are working off of the same. I know that we've all distributed the data again. It's all been available to us since the very first meeting that we have. We should just sort of recapture that and revisit that to make sure that we're working, have that available to us and are using that again. I love the idea that whenever we can achieve or continue to work towards achieving all 6 of the criteria in the constitutional criteria, as well as meeting with the respect and the responses that we got, that we received from the public. Anytime we're moving down that path, I'm going to be in agreement. So I'm delighted that if we're able to meet numbers 1 and 2, and that numbers 3 through 6 are also being followed and respected, that's going to move the ball down the field.
Okay, so you guys will be dealing with this over the weekend. Any other legislative district discussion we need to have from a voting rights perspective?
Madam Chair?
Mr. Sturts?
Also, just as a request from Strategic, if you could date and time this whenever you're today, in other words, so that you could also load where you are today on this version, even though it's not been integrated, you've not completed your analysis. It would be good to continue along with you in looking at what you'll be working on as well.
We have been and will continue to do.
All right.
Date staff.
But I'm not talking about for loading it onto our personal data.
Oh, okay.
Even though we shouldn't be uploading it to the website at this point because we've not integrated it, it'd be good to load it on for our work product.
Okay, yes, we can do that.
Thank you.
Any other discussion we want to have on any of the legislative districts from a voting rights perspective?
I'll just ask a question. We talked about improving all the districts, but we're focusing on these 4. Are we just, in the future, going to be looking at the others, or do we, I mean, the others seem fine to me, is there anything that you're expecting from us on the other voting rights districts? I guess is my question, or is there anything you will be bringing back to us on the other legislative voting rights districts?
If I can start to answer that, and then I'm sure Mr. Adelson will want to add to it. My sense is that once we've looked at the changes to these 3 districts, we would be at a position where if the commission wanted to vote to tentatively freeze, or whatever we called them, for the in-depth analysis, the others would be fine. But of course, if Mr. Adelson has any others that we want to look at specifically, now's the time.
Madam Chair, and following up on what Mr. Strasman said, I think that as we had talked about the other day, that there are the questions that I've mentioned, and I know that those questions are being analyzed and will continue to be analyzed. I think that the working map districts 2, 4, 24, and 26 that we've been talking about are a good snapshot of districts that, because of public comment or things that we've been discussing, suggest that additional attention. But in moving forward, I'm certainly comfortable with where things have been going so far, pending the additional analysis that's necessary for the submission and to confirm our suppositions about the district so far.
Thank you. Any other questions, comments? Okay, so on Monday, we'll see a change report for LD2 too, in terms of what that would look like.
So I think as it stands now,
LD1, 2.
I'll probably present 2. One would be just the
change report for this, and then we can discuss. I'm sorry, I was off the microphone. I think the plan would be we will present this change and a change report, and also the recommendation that we come up with in consultation with the lawyers over the course of the weekend as to whether or not this looks okay. And then we can decide, I guess, one of 3 approaches: good, don't do it, or try some other approaches.
Okay, sounds good. Great, thank you. So let's check the time. Sure, we can, it's 2:25. We'll take a quick 5-minute break. Be back shortly. This is over. We'll go ahead and get started. It's 2:43 p.m. and we were in the midst of discussing adjustments to legislative districts, particularly voting rights districts. Are there any other thoughts we want to cover before we move on to talking about congressional?
Madam Chair, I had one point I wanted to note. We've talked about sort of improving the numbers, improving the strength of the voting rights district. The other, and some conversation about the public input down in LD2. But there are other districts where we receive public input that would have an impact on voting rights districts that may not have come up in these discussions. For example, in Maricopa County, we have, 3 Indian tribes, 2 of which are in voting rights districts in our legislative plan, and how they come into play and any changes that might be considered. There's an Eastern Arizona proposal that had a lot of support in Eastern Arizona, but had a significant impact on District 7. And so perhaps Monday, when we're talking about LD2 and those changes, we talk about some of those other public input. The lawyers have been looking at that and also looking at all the public input affecting minority districts. And so maybe we can have that conversation in more detail at the next meeting.
Sure, that sounds good. Any other comments or thoughts?
Madam Chair?
Mr. Sturts?
In regards to the level of detail that we're talking about, you had said earlier that the only way that we're going to be able to, and I think Commissioner McNulty, you really alluded to it pretty clearly, is my understanding that there's been ongoing analysis that has been taking place. What is the deeper analysis that's going to take place once we presumably fix these districts? Because I'm trying to find out what hasn't been.
Yeah, it's a great question, but there is more analysis. So I'd ask actually Bruce Adelson to address that question, and if Ken wanted to chime in.
Excuse me, Madam Chair and Commissioner Sturts, yes, I think that, let's talk a little bit about what some of that analysis is. We have the questions that I raised earlier in the week about using residents from districts that currently cannot elect and putting them into districts that are proposed majority-minority districts, whether or not that changes the district. Does that weaken the district? Is that a retrogressive issue? None of the districts as they are now suggest something that jumps off the page as a problem, but these are questions that we will have to answer to meet our burden of proof with the department. Looking at additional elections, like for example the Proposition 200 contest in 2004 may be indicative of polarized voting and minority support in certain jurisdictions. In the Texas litigation, for example, the United States is analyzing or has analyzed 5 elections from various years in each of the majority-minority districts to determine their effectiveness. So the department has indicated in that case, which is certainly correct, that analyzing an election from one cycle is not enough, that you need to analyze multiple contests over several cycles to get a snapshot of voter performance and electoral performance. So those are some examples of additional information that needs to be analyzed, and this needs to also have the analysis of Dr. King to plug into his ecological inference analysis, racially polarized voting, so that we can have these questions answered, not only for our sake and for your sake, of course, but also to answer the questions from the department and meet our burden. So that's kind of a snapshot of what additionally needs to be done, so that in the things that we've looked at today, as we had talked about earlier, just looking at a very cursory review of the change orders, there does not seem to be any problems with the changes relative to the draft majority-minority districts. But we need to be as sure as we can statistically. To do that, we need to have the other analysis that we've been talking about. But is that helpful?
Yes. With a continuation, is it your expectation that that we would not be moving forward with that level of analysis until the commission made a substantive agreement that those districts would be the ones that would be fixed to move forward to analyze?
Well, I think Commissioner Sturts, as we were talking about with the locking in tentatively of the majority-minority districts and having them analyzed as a group, subject to additional analysis, I think that, as we were talking about, I think that makes sense to facilitate moving forward with whatever additions, changes, alterations that the commission is interested in the non-majority-minority districts, because it will take time to do the analysis necessary to meet our burden and answer the questions that we've talked about, and also answer the questions that the department will have. So to facilitate moving forward, I think it was a good point that was raised earlier about locking them in tentatively, subject to additional analysis.
Okay. As I think a final follow-up to that, the draft maps, as they were approved, I'm trying to determine why we would need to this gets into my head, the old we've got to approve it before we find out what's in it scenario, and that concerns me, that we are going to have to approve it and then find out whether or not it works. I'm hearing that most of the way that we've gone down this path is that they're working, and you're looking to prove that an additional layer of proof.
Commissioner Sturts, I think that's a great way to look at it, that in satisfying the burden of proof, the level of analysis that's been done now is suggestive that things are moving in a very positive direction as far as Section 5 is concerned. In order to satisfy federal law and satisfy the department, you're exactly right, that we're at the stage now of proving things. And from my perspective, and looking at things skeptically as I can with the eye of the department, I look at it as, yeah, okay, this says X, prove it. So by doing the additional analysis that we've been talking about, that's proving it, that there isn't anything here that jumps off the page at me that suggests, boy, this is a major problem. There's nothing like that. This is all from a Section 5 standpoint, dotting all the I's and crossing all the T's, and the most important point is so that we have answers to questions that the department will have, so they don't have to come back to you to answer their questions in the request for additional information, that's what happened 9 years ago. Having that, anticipating their questions and having answers for them is part of meeting our burden of proof.
Again, Madam Chair, if you can indulge me in a couple of other questions. I guess my anticipation was that the report that was prepared, I'll call it the off-season, that we've been presented with against the draft maps would have been would have actually taken it down to that higher level. And are we saying that level of detail is not included in this?
Commissioner Sturts, the level of detail in the analysis is very good. What can be very frustrating, and for me sometimes, frankly, mind-numbing about the whole entire process, and I don't mean the process in Arizona, is that all of the information that the state is required to provide, let's assume that we use that analysis without anything else as the basis for the submission. Then we're presuming that the department may just accept what we have, which they would have to do, but if they have any questions about it, if we're just relying on what we have, we may not have the answers. If they had it right now, they would have the same questions that I've had about using, for example, residents from districts that cannot currently elect. What effect does that have? And the memo does speak to that, but the memo doesn't speak to it to the level of what's happening in the Texas case. And these things just happened in the last week or two. So that looking at that case and seeing that the department has analyzed 5 elections per district, as I said, this just came up in the last 2 or 3 weeks. So this is relatively new, and I believe can be a reflection of the change to Section 5 in 2006 that President Bush signed into law. That could be indicative of their approach in a public way, which we have the benefit of seeing, their approach to the new Section 5. In the typical pre-clearance process, outsiders don't have an opportunity to see what the department is doing. We have the fortune of seeing how this plays out publicly by reviewing what the department has filed. So that is a tremendous benefit for us. And so frankly, I'm very grateful to the state of Texas that they timed things the way they did, so we have the opportunity to learn from what the department has filed.
I appreciate that. That leads me into my next question, is that we appear to be, or we have gone down the path in these 3 analyses that were done today in quote unquote improving these districts, which means that it's a presumption that they needed improvement.
Commissioner Sturts, thank you for that question, because that's a great point. I think from my perspective, I would use the word enhance rather than improve, and not suggest that there was a problem that needed to be fixed. So I look at it as if you have a jewel and you polish it and it shines, but you can polish it a little more to get it shine brighter. So I like to use the word enhance, because as I said, I haven't seen anything from a Section 5 perspective that just jumps off the page. So the more things can be enhanced and questions can be answered, so that when the department calls, we just run down the list and say, okay, here's the answer to this, 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 and this. They say, thank you very much. It's a short phone call. And then they go back and start doing more analysis. So that, to me, that's my goal. And it seems as if the process is moving along in a very positive way to get to that favored endpoint. Thank you.
So the concept of enhancement, and this is leading back into now the District 1, LD1, LD2 analysis that's going to take place this week, because there was, in the analyses that were done for today, it was subtle adjustments around the edges and perimeter, whereas we're making a potentially substantive change in LD1 and LD2. So that's the when we're looking for enhancing certain districts, we're also looking at what may be the reaction for trying to react to some of the other constitutional criteria as how they're going to play into effect on the current district. So I think this leads back into the question about process that we've been talking about, is that if we, I'm trying to ascertain how much more we're going to learn by fixing these districts while we're still doing adjustments to the other districts based on other constitutional criteria. And I want to caution fixing them because we have an ongoing analysis. We know that we've had some enhancements to 3 of the districts now. We know that we're going to be doing an analysis of a 4th of the 10 districts over the weekend. We still have got to contemplate all of the other public testimony and integrate. So prior to quote unquote fixing or establishing them as being where our goal would be, reviewing those against the benchmarks, I think is imperative. And continuing to ask these questions on a case-by-case basis as we move forward is also going to be very important. So I guess from a process perspective, that's where I'd like it to continue to go.
Yeah, I agree with that. That all sounds like what we're trying to accomplish. And I think what people said yesterday about first do no harm, it's sounding like, based on that initial RPV analysis that's been done, that nothing jumped off the page, and that all those districts on both maps, the voting rights districts on both maps, were sound. And now it's this game of enhancements, that if there are things around the edges that we can do, we should, but we also then need to and ensure that we're not worsening the numbers in any way, but also taking in public comment, which I think we're going to be talking about on Monday. Anything that impacts those voting rights districts, we also need to be considering too at the same time. So, but once we get done with that, I would really like to lock in, so to speak, those districts, so that then that deeper analysis can get done that Bruce just described on those voting rights districts. And it's a tentative lock-in because, of course, if the analysis comes back and we need to make changes, we will. So we just have to keep pressing forward, and we know that that analysis is going to take at least 2 weeks, and the sooner we can get that moving down the path, the better, in my opinion. Was there anything you wanted to add, Mr. Strasma, to any of that discussion?
I did just want to clarify the process for the longer-term analysis once the lock-in happens. In the districts where we've made subtle changes and have shown improvements based on percent Hispanic and the mine inspector race, I would be very surprised if the analysis showed that those improvements worsened the district. But well, obviously isn't acceptable to DOJ. So we need to have that level of analysis as part of our submission, and the sooner we start, the better.
Okay. Any other comments on legislative? All right. Okay, we're on to the next agenda item, which is the congressional districts. And I know that Ms. McNulty yesterday presented some concepts, overarching concepts, and maybe you'd like to go over those again. And then she also had specific ways to accomplish those overarching concepts and provided those notes. And I think Mr. Bladine sent those around to all of us, so we should all the commissioners should have a copy of those suggested changes. And I know our mapping consultant was going to be just working on the voting rights, so they didn't have time to do the congressional, but that'll be something for their fun weekend. But I think it would be worth starting to talk again, just to go over what yours were, and then I know Mr. Sturts is going to have some additional things he'd like to see, so he's ready to give that presentation too. But we'll start with Ms. McNulty since she started yesterday.
Well, in keeping with the concept of first do no harm, what I had proposed were some small changes that I thought had large impact in terms of responding to several pieces of public comment that we heard again and again. One was to remove the portion of Congressional District 1 that extended down into Cochise County, so that Cochise County was whole. That had the effect of reducing the size of Congressional District 1 a little bit, increasing the compactness a little bit, and most importantly, responding to the public comment to keep Cochise County whole. That resulted in some overpopulation in District 2 that needed to be moved into District 3, and I proposed an area kind of in the South Tucson area, south of 22nd Street along the interstate, that overpopulated District 3, and kind of moved around from there. The District 1 underpopulation would be resolved by addressing the public comment we heard concerning the community of interest of the town of Oak Creek, or the village of Oak Creek, and it would combine Oak Creek with Sedona, which I think was really an oversight when we first prepared the congressional map. I'm not sure we were aware that we had split those two communities. At the same time, I proposed to move the community of Fountain Hills from Congressional District 4 back into the Phoenix metropolitan area. And that had the effect of addressing a lot of public comment, a lot of concern about moving those communities. I don't see that entire area as a community of interest, but I do at the same time think that the Commission can take into account how best to align communities in congressional districts, and we can certainly respond to public comment. And there was a lot of concern about having Fountain Hills separated from Scottsdale. We had comment from the Fort McDowell tribe requesting that the three of those communities be in one congressional district. And then to accomplish all of those things without making any substantial changes to the balance of the map, We made some population changes, combined some splits of counties and communities, Wickenburg, Gila. There was one more in northwestern Maricopa County. So those are all things that I think Ken and Willie are going to be looking at. But it was kind of a zero-sum move of around the clock that didn't have any other ripple effects on the map.
Okay, thank you. Any comments or questions on Ms. McNulty's suggested changes? We covered those in detail yesterday, and we all have copies of her notes that the mapping consultant will be working on over the weekend. Okay, so Mr. Sturts, you have some additional things you'd like to see them do?
I do, and I will. I'm struggling with opening up my Maptitude map that I've got this on, so I'm going to work my way through this from my notes. Oh, really? Not often does somebody ask me that.
Madam
Can't
Chair,
hear me.
and Commissioner Sturts, will you be able to email around a summary of this as well?
Oh, positively.
Okay, I'm just wondering how often I should interrupt you for clarification. If my note taking is too slow, I will refrain from doing that, knowing that there'll be details coming after.
No, in fact, that the mechanism that and the methodology that Commissioner McNulty used is one that I will modify my notes to match in an effort to make it very easy as far as population transfer and reasonings behind. I'll give you a general overview. It was the keeping of Cochise County whole. There were the 76-31 movement needed to be readjusted. The biggest change that I am going to be proposing is going to be the inclusion of putting Oro Valley, Marana, Saddlebrook back whole again with the city of Tucson, and making Marana back whole. I'm able to do that by that they then go from back into CD2. It makes the change, adjusts from the the aviation corridor connection. It pulls that all the way over to Alvernon, and that's what's allowing me to make the deviation of the population. I'm also, and I haven't worked out the total offset of population of Apache Junction, the Santan, and Florence, bringing them into CD1, and I'm working on that at this time. But the general over the 30,000-foot view for Commissioner McNulty's recommendations after reviewing those last night make perfect sense, and I'll be emailing out a similar detail, as well as I've mapped this already, so that I can forward that to Mr. Desmond and the rest as well. So I've already mapped these changes. I'm not sure why, and maybe during break I can figure out why I can't open the file.
Great, thank you. Any questions for Mr. Sturts on that? I don't hear any from the other commissioner, so. Okay, so you'll be sending those to Mr. Bladine or Mr. Desmond?
Yes,
I'll make sure
and I
that
was
we
just
get
able
them.
to open it, so I could actually take you down the streets and the roads, but it's going to make it easier for me to give you this map. And I'll also re-prepare it in such a way as to match Commissioner McNulty's spreadsheet. I thought that was very well done.
Great. Okay. Is there anything on the voting rights districts for the congressional map that we need to discuss? The two.
Madam Chair, I just reiterate what I had said yesterday about wanting to see if there are residents that have been brought into the working maps, majority-minority districts, from districts where they cannot elect currently, and if so, then we'll need to analyze that their being in these districts is not potentially retrogressive. And the comment that I made yesterday about the similarity between the minority population and the Maricopa district, currently the benchmark district and the proposed district are very similar. Ms. O'Grady and I had a chance to talk about that, and she was telling me about population growth in certain areas potentially being higher to support, and the growth rates being higher to support the numbers being very similar. That's a great example of something from a narrative standpoint that would be in the submission to explain to Justice why the population numbers are so close, which again is not suggestive that there's a problem, but that is a question that they will ask. And looking at the numbers, they'll say, oh, the population numbers between the benchmark and what the commission has sent us are virtually the same. Why is that? Then they'll look at the narrative description, as Ms. O'Grady was talking about, that shows population growth justifying that, so that the danger of retrogression by effect, accidental retrogression over time, is much less. But that's a great example of something that may not appear in this chart showing the comparison between the two plans, but it is in census data and other demographic information, which would be part of the submission to meet the commission's burden and show that there's no retrogression.
Okay, any questions or comments for Mr. Adelson on that one?
We're doing that analysis, right?
Someone's doing it.
Commissioner McNulty, Madam, oh, I'm sorry, my microphone, the soft part fell off. I'm sorry, guys, I did it again. Yes, that analysis is ongoing. The demographic information is something that to paraphrase what the department says, it's either there or not. And as Ms. O'Grady was explaining, the fact that that does exist, that's not something that necessarily involves analysis. It's more including in the narrative description of the submission to make sure that in telling the story, Justice understands why the populations are basically so equivalent. So it's less analysis and more narrative.
And I don't think I put my comments on the record yesterday. I was taking issue with the idea that we had to bump those up, because I don't think we do. And when we pre-cleared, when the DOJ pre-cleared the Maricopa County Voting Rights District last time, the specific demographic information there, that it was pre-cleared at a 51.8% Hispanic VAP level, and but over the course of the decade, it actually became more Hispanic up until it, was at the 56% level or so, where it is when we started our redistricting process. And we bumped it up a couple tenths of a percent, but not much. It's basically the same. But it's not an area, it's an area that's grown more Hispanic. And in terms of the concern that was also expressed about whether it has a strong incumbent and whether that it would need to improve in case it didn't have that same strong incumbent, at least the analysis that we have, and it will get deeper. When you look at the mine inspector race, the mine inspector actually ran better in 2010 than the incumbent in the congressional race. So it runs strong for the other races that have been tested so far. So, but again, that's just the narrative, that's just the explanation to explain why it's not retrogressive. And I think we're on the same page there now.
And then we had that input from the Hispanic Coalition for Good Government, the letter we received yesterday, and those are some precinct level kind of changes, I think, that were suggested that I think our mapping consultant has a copy of, and we're going to take a look at.
So we'll have that for Monday.
Okay.
Have that loaded up and the change report ready to look at how that would impact the plan.
Good.
And Madam Chair, since I am able to bring my map up right now, I'd like to at least walk through some of the changes I'm going to be recommending.
Sure.
Okay. I'll start with CD1. CD1, I am not keeping. Am recommending that Cochise County still has a small split in it. It starts north of Interstate 10 and picks up and moves Sierra Vista, Fort Huachuca, going all the way down to the border of Arizona and Mexico, to the corner point of, it's just outside of Cochise from CD1 into CD2. It follows the river splitting Santa Cruz County, bringing half of Santa Cruz County into CD2, and it brings Saddlebrook, Oro Valley, Marana out of CD1 and places it into CD2, following County Road or State Road 79 and going north by voter block north of the 77, following county, and then going west to the county line back south.
And not to disrupt the flow
You're
too
welcome.
much, but I will, if it's okay, Madam
Please.
Chair. Commissioner, as you once you kind of wrap up your detailed description, maybe step back and link it to the constitutional criteria or public input. That will be helpful in terms of the record.
I will be,
that's made.
and
That'd be
I'll
great.
do that right
Area by area.
area by area. So in regards to the, and I appreciate that, in regards to the public comment that we received, there were 2 layers of public comment that we received. One was to keep Cochise County intact, and the other was that there was a stronger relationship between Sierra Vista, Fort Huachuca, and Tucson than there was with Sierra Vista, Fort Huachuca, and Douglas. So I've made that connection. There was also a deeper connection with the eastern side of Santa Cruz County with Sierra Vista and Fort Huachuca, making that a community of interest. We also have a geographic feature of 2 mountain ranges, both flanking to the southwest and to the northeast, allowing those areas to be flanked by mountain districts. In regards to Oro Valley, Saddlebrook, Marana, and that we heard tremendous amount of testimony in regards to the relationship between Oro Valley, Saddlebrook, and Marana to the city of Tucson, where they were linked as a community of interest, including traffic corridors, and they are also flanked by geography and by transportation. As we move further into the Maricopa County, moving Apache Junction, Santan, and Florence out of CD4 and into CD1. Those are the relationship the comments that we've heard in Casa Grande and in Pinal County, as well as from the residents of Johnson Ranch, Santan, and Apache Junction, and Florence, that Florence should be remaining in its county where it is its county seat, and that Apache Junction and Santan are both contiguous in their transportation corridors, in their shopping habits, as well as their communities and how their relationships work. There was a greater sense and a higher sense of relationship between those communities than there were with those communities being linked over into the northwest corner of the state. So those are the substantive changes outside of the ones that Commissioner McNulty has already recommended. And I'll be documenting these as well as the constitutional criteria of why their inclusions would want to be put into place. And I'll put those into the record via email.
Great. So how will that work from a change report perspective in terms of seeing what Mr. Sturtz's suggestions and Ms. McNulty's do? Can you go over that again for us?
We will prepare those as 2 separate change reports. The ones that you saw for the voting rights districts were a fairly small number of districts affected, 2 or 3. These will be longer, multi-page reports because of the sort of round-the-clock effect necessary for both of these. So we will have one set of change reports for each of these two approaches.
And then what about the voting rights changes? Would that be a third one? The ones from the Hispanic Coalition for Good Government?
Yes, that would be a third one. And I know there's a few other that we're working on time permitting, but we would, in keeping with the strategy of prioritizing the voting rights to get tentative approval, we'll do those first and
Great.
maybe get to some of the other technical things.
Okay, that sounds fair. Everybody good?
Madam Chair, I'd just like to make the comment on the Hispanic Coalition for Good Government changes. The change in districts 2 and 3, it looks fairly discrete, and that there is probably a way to make a swap between those two districts that would accommodate that. And I was kind of looking at that last night, but I haven't had a chance to finish that. The changes proposed in District 7 seem to me to be more comprehensive, and I need more time to think about all of that. That seems to me to implicate have broader implications than the proposed change in District 3.
With that in mind, we'll see if we can implement those as separate changes so they can be analyzed separately.
Thank you.
Great. Any other comments on congressional that we want to talk about?
Madam Chair?
Mr. Sturts?
As a follow-up to Commissioner McNulty's, and you're right in looking at the CD7, we've got some, we're not just affecting geography, but we're affecting some pretty big population centers. Commissioner McNulty, did you have the opportunity to study any of those?
No, I just started looking at the change in 3 last night, and I really haven't had a chance to look at 7 at all. It just seemed to me that there was a fair bit to look at.
Yeah, in my quick analysis of it, we have some population shifts that would need to be accounted for, and as we're contemplating some of these other changes that we are looking at for the potential of not only enhancing CD7 and improving the quality of the environment as it pertains to the constitutional criteria as recommended by the Hispanic Coalition's letter. We might also be able to pick up and to make some, integrate some of the recommendations that we heard through public testimony on the adjacent districts. So for example, there might be a place in a 9 or a 5 or a 6 that we might be able to make some improvements on. Some areas that might have had some edges that might want it to be cleaned up that because of the transfer of population that may occur. So I want to be able to take all those into account simultaneously.
I would go back to, my perspective is to go back to Ms. O'Grady's comment that CD7 looks very good right now and is a very strong district, and I'm not sure that we need to improve it. So I want to take that into account also as we look at what's been requested. I think making the improvements in the legislative districts falls in a slightly different category than the congressional districts, where I think we have 2 very solid districts. We just have one issue of proof, so to speak, issue of analysis and documentation that Mr. Adelson has asked for, but I don't think we have any suggestion that we need to improve either of these districts.
So, Madam Chair?
Mr. Sturts?
Commissioner McNulty, are you suggesting that we not take into consideration the letter that was delivered yesterday by the Hispanic Coalition?
Got it. No, I definitely am suggesting that we consider it. As I said, I just had a chance to start looking at it. And the change in CD3 seems fairly discrete. The change proposed in CD7, I need to spend some more time with before I draw any conclusions.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other comments on congressional districts? Thank you both for your suggestions for the adjustments and the presentations, and we'll look forward to seeing what they result in on Monday, I guess.
Madam Chair?
To the extent you're able to complete all of it.
Before we move on, I think we moved from Voting Rights Act legislative districts to congressional districts, and I think I missed your call for other comments on legislative districts, and I did have a couple thoughts about things that I'd like strategic telemetry to be thinking about on legislative districts that don't bear on the majority districts we looked at.
Sure, I'm not sure I gave that call, so thanks for prompting me. There's definitely an opportunity for us to go back and talk about legislative districts, other opportunities outside of voting rights districts, and so if you would like to go over some now.
Okay, just a couple. There are others that I'm looking at and thinking about. I think some things that legal counsel is looking at that do potentially relate to the voting rights districts, and some that I just haven't worked through yet. But a couple of things that I thought were fairly discrete that I might raise that we might think about are in Legislative District 6. We heard a lot of comment about the fact that we have Show Low and Pine Top in separate legislative districts when they really are, adjacent communities. And my suggestion or my request is that we look at moving the town of, swapping in LD6, the town of Winslow, which would come out of the Native American district, into the Flagstaff district. And comparable in population almost, we would move Show Low into the district with Pine Top. And that would solve a lot of comment. It would also bring Winslow and that I-40 corridor, kind of that we heard a lot of discussion about in Flagstaff, together. And I wondered if we could look at whether there's a way to do that while at the same time keeping most of the tribal lands that we heard discussed in the Native American district. I don't know if we have I think we have the information about where most of that is. It seemed like so that was one thought. And then my other thought, I don't know if we want to discuss that first. I'll just throw them both out there and we can discuss both of them. Legislative District 23, the existing legislative district is and has been for some time a competitive district. So I would like to look at what we might do to create a more competitive district in Pinal County out of we currently have the proposed legislative districts 8 and 11. And there are different ways we could configure those towns, which work or which don't work, probably in equal measure from various perspectives. And I'd like to look at whether there's a way that we can improve the competitiveness of one of those districts.
Having been at the Honda hearing, I would definitely concur that Show Low and Pine Top want to be together, and so that's definitely a change that I had on my list. But any thoughts, Mr. Sturts?
Madam Chair, we've received from Eager, Pine Top, Lakeside, Show Low, Springerville. I can't go down the entire list, 15 different city resolutions and 5 different county resolutions to bring those communities back. I think that the Show Low, Pine Top, Lakeside corridor is imperative to keep intact as a great starting point. But I'd want to introduce all of those start to bring all of that engagement. There's that group of 15 cities alone represents close to 70,000 residents that the cities themselves took the time to provide resolutions of what they were looking for. And the counties that are being represented are close to 200,000 population that are being represented. So I want to make sure that although of course, I'm not prepared to go through the details of the remedy today. We can certainly bring that to, and be prepared to do that on Monday, as far as some potential remedies to meet with the desires of those residents, of those 70,000 of cities combined and 200,000 in counties. Some of those are not going to be able to be met in their entirety, but I'd like to at least give it a try to do the best we can to meet with their.
Okay, sounds good. So how will we, I think, are we going to focus on the voting rights districts first, on both congressional and legislative? I'm just thinking of the priorities. And then we look at the additional changes, adjustments that we might consider on the congressional, and then we do legislative. How do you guys want to proceed on that in terms of giving priorities to our mapping consultant?
Sounds like we need to do the analysis on the majority and minority districts on the legislative side and get that underway. So that's our first priority. Is that right? And then second priority, majority on the congressional side. So all of that can be in progress while we're working on the other things.
And Madam Chair, some of these affect majority-minority, the Sholo-Winslow swap do affect majority-minority districts. And so I would think that anything that touches on a majority-minority district would count, not just those things that when we were specifically focusing on the majority.
Got it.
Minority.
Yeah,
And
good
same
point.
with the Eastern Arizona thing is a majority-minority district issue.
Okay, so any adjustments that would impact, based on public comment, any of those adjustments that would impact the majority-minority districts, we'd want to prioritize over the others. Okay, so you guys feel comfortable with our direction?
Yes, if allow me to repeat it to make sure I understand correctly. We will be working through the congressional changes provided by Commissioner McNulty, and that Commissioner Sturts will be sending around. We will, the Hispanic Coalition for Good Government changes, we will prepare as separate change maps, and we will be preparing details on the LD1 adjustment that we discussed earlier today. And those would be our first priorities in hopes that we can get tentative lock-in on changes to minority districts on Monday.
Does that sound accurate to you all?
The analysis is, would it be a correct statement that the analysis needs to begin progressing on the Hispanic majority-minority districts? Do we have the same concern about the Native American districts, the same analysis? Does that need to be undertaken? And if so, I guess we would need to include in what Ken just said, LD6 and CD1.
Commissioner McNulty, Madam Chair, I mean, to the extent that for the majority Native American district, that there are contemplated changes, the effect is the same as for the majority Hispanic districts to determine if there is any retrogression in changes that are being discussed. So to that degree, yes. Anything that implicates that district just as the other 9 would be the same as far as an analytical priority, I guess.
Okay. Anything else on this? We want any direction or guidance, comments, questions?
Madam Chair?
Mr. Sturts?
We have not had a business meeting. I know this is not an agendized item, but we have not, we've got some business that we need to be taking care of as well. And I'm jumping because the answer is no, I don't have anything else on that point. But we are going to need to start to take care of some of the outstanding business items. And there's nothing on our agenda today to speak about future agenda.
Right, so I'm not sure how much detail we can go into on that, but I know that Mr. Bladine received some direction the other day from us as to his executive director report and things that he'll be bringing to the meeting next week. And those agendas haven't been set yet, to my knowledge, so.
That's right.
Okay.
I think he's also prepared to talk with us at any time that any of us have questions outside of the meeting, too.
Right.
Okay. Okay. So that takes us to agenda item 5. I'm not sure on 5 and 6 if there's anything you needed to, okay? So we just have public comment left, and right now I only have one request to speak form, and Mr. Bladine's bringing up some, and others have things, so. Great, thank you. I do too.
Air conditioning in there. It's making my head hurt. Keeps coming and going. Can't hear.
Yeah, I like the other room better.
Great room, just terrible. The air conditioning.
Just as a reminder for anyone who comes up to speak to us, please state your name and spell it so that our court reporter gets an accurate transcript. And we'll go ahead and start with the first person. I don't think we have a lot of requests to speak forms, so. Jana Granillo, representing Self from Tempe.
Hello, my name is Jana, Jana, and the last name is spelled Granillo. It's Granillo. I live in Tempe. I'm representing myself, and I thank you all for giving the public an opportunity to comment. I currently live in the area that is proposed District 26. So today's meeting was of most interest to me as you were looking at the different geographic areas to carve out. For that particular area, I consider myself middle class, although I think I'm probably poorer than middle class, but I'll take that. And the neighborhoods that I live in, it's mixed housing. There's homes and there are some high density housing in there, apartments in Tempe. I live in Tempe. The schools have lost population, and I know that the statistics that you're using are only as good as the time as when they were received or when you got them. But I will tell you, for my particular daughter's school, that we have lost population. Okay. So as reflective of some of the current, the way it looks. Also, there's a lot of empty houses because of the economy and because of the high density people moving in and out of that particular area. So I just wanted to share that reflection as far as the characteristics of that particular area. Yes, I know you have your statistics, but for me personally, I'd like to see it as much increase of the minority majority as possible. And I also know that you're not looking at income and poverty. And poverty is a really good indicator about the vulnerable populations and their ability to vote. So I'd just like to throw that out there as far as Legislative District 26. And as you were making the little move, I missed the jog by that much of being either included in 26 or not. Whether it stays that way or not, it's not going to make a difference to me. I think what it would make a difference for folks who are involved in trying to get out the vote and trying to figure out where they fall on particular lines. So if that has any relevance in some of your decision making, straight lines are always easier to communicate to the public, especially for vulnerable populations who have a lot of challenges in understanding where they stand and how they vote and where they go. So that was my point there. Also, as a longtime resident of the state of Arizona, I heard you guys talking earlier about Yuma and the Republican vote there. That's a big military area. So regardless of the demographics there, they have to support the economy, and the economy is the military, and McCain is a military man. So just want to offer that insight to you all. And finally, as I heard today, the proposal of Mr. Biggs coming to speak to you all regarding their work that they've done. I was part of the hearing on day one of the Senate testimonies, and I'm here to tell you that that was a hostile environment. So as a citizen, I would say that if you had a different opinion than the majority of that board, it was a hostile environment. And to take their comments with a grain of salt. In other words, offering caution to what proposals that they do. Also, for that particular hearing and from the legislative body, I saw on day 2 where they were looking at where people who are where congressmen live. And that's not part of the criteria. So to quote one of our famous House representatives, I think that poisons the water in considering what they propose. And I hope that that doesn't carry any more weight than what the citizens and other people have brought to you or will bring to you for your consideration. Thank you so much for the work that you all have done, and I am just so glad that you're here and that this process is working, and you're proving to the state of Arizona that this process can work. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Chase Williams, representing Self from Maricopa County. Thank you.
That's Chase, C-H-A-S-E, Williams, W-I-L-L-I-A-M-S. Just some general things that were talked about today. First, when we were talking about whether we give more weight to certain elections or not, I think the fact that the McCain vote in 2004 was so lopsided probably means that there should be less weight given to that race, because it's not a accurate reflection of election to election. It's, you know, one candidate who happens to be very popular in this state. So that's just one comment there. Also, on the changes to LD 26, there were slight changes in the competitiveness of 18 on a few of the indexes, so I want to make sure that we take a closer look at that and make sure we're not harming the competitiveness of that district, because in that, as well as congressional districts, when you're moving groups of people on these statistics, you're also moving ideologies, so we have to make sure that we're not messing with the competitiveness of a district like 18. Another thing in the East Valley, especially the way that neighborhoods are created by the developers, it may look like just a statistic on a box that you're moving, you know, one block, but it could be the middle of a development that's already established or something like that. So I just want to make sure that we're examining those things, especially in that LD 26 and 28 area. Furthermore, I would like to commend Commissioner McNulty on her proposal for 8 and 11 to make those more competitive. I think the more competitive districts we have, it means more people get involved, and the more people that get involved, the stronger our democracy is. And on congressional districts, I want to make sure that we're not touching 9. Commissioner Sturts mentioned that if we do some things with 7, we can mess with 9. But 9 is almost a perfect competitive district, which is what we heard over and over again in public testimony. So I think we need to preserve that type of competitive 50-50 district. Also, we have to make sure that we keep Congressional District 1 competitive. If we make these changes with Cochise County and the rest of the state, we have to make sure that we're not removing competitiveness because of these public comments, because I think that public comments across the state ask for more competitive, and although I may not live in Congressional District 1, their vote still affects me on the national level. So if I want competitiveness for the entire state and all of our districts, it shouldn't just matter that people in Cochise County wanted some changes. Also on the legislative presentation that you're expecting next week, I want to remind the commission that those same people voted to remove the chairwoman, and they and the governor have both taken lots of actions to try and make this process partisan instead of independent. So I would ask you to make sure that you're taking their presentation with a grain of salt, because they do have a partisan agenda, as they've said over and over. And as the previous speaker outlined, their report actually takes into account things for a partisan goal that don't even apply to this commission. So when they come and speak to you tomorrow, just because they are a state senator does not make their voice any more powerful just because they're making this presentation, because they do have partisan agendas, and we have to make sure that we're identifying those and making sure that they're not creating a corruption process within this commission. And finally, for the Sturts and McNulty proposals on the congressional districts, I was wondering if there's any way we could get just like the general outline of what you want to do online this weekend before we actually see the map, so that the people that will be here next week can have a better idea, other than just these random roads and things that were mentioned in the transcript. I don't know if we can also see the email that details those things, or if something be posted online so that we can evaluate those over the weekend as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Betty Bankson, representing Self from Pima.
Betty Bankson, B-E-T-T-Y, B-E-N-G-T-S-O-N. We were a little late arriving today, so I didn't hear all of the discussion. But I just want to say that I'm happy to see the chairwoman back in her position and the commission back at work again. You all have worked very hard under very difficult circumstances, and I just want to encourage you to keep up the good work and to work through all the partisanship and the rhetoric that you hear that is not always pleasant to hear. So it's so important for our state to have this independent commission process and to see that the commission remain independent. So thank you for your work, and keep it up. Thanks.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Pete Bankson, representing Self from Pima County.
It's Peter Bankson, P-E-T-E-R-B-E-N-G-T-S-O-N. You all know I'm a competitive district guy, so I won't talk about that anymore. I really am pleased to see Colin Mathis back as the chair. It's really important. The other thing I wanted to comment on, I wanted to commend Linda McNulty for her comments last night. I was watching online. One of the things that struck me was there are a lot of comments that have been made where you can't make any changes. The one thing that was obvious to me is this CD1, the big rural district on the east side, where there was a lot of comment about they wanted rural districts, or then the people in Oro Valley didn't want to be included in that district. There's not much you can do with a big rural district like that. There's not many people out there. You're going to have to suck up some suburban areas like Oro Valley or somewhere in Maricopa County. And I was pleased to see the Commissioner McNulty recognize that some of these comments you just can't do anything about. And finally, I don't have any problems with any of the congressional or legislative districts that I'm in. I live in a suburban area, and it doesn't make a lot of difference whether I'm in one legislative district or another. So I guess in the suburban areas, I don't think it matters all that much. So just make it competitive. That's all you need to do. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Steve Muratori, publisher, Arizona Eagletarian.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, Commissioners. My name's Steve Muratori, M-U-R-A-T-O-R-E. I have 2 points. Number one, I wanted to address the issue of the change reports, change orders, touches on some of what Mr. Williams said. It occurs to me that if the mapping consultant is preparing these things on digital files, they should be considered their work should be considered incomplete if they come to the meeting without making a file that can be, during that meeting, at least posted to the website. Because we have no clue what the heck you're talking about, you know, if we can't see it. And from my perspective, that presents a dramatic lapse in the ability of the public to understand your deliberations, and I don't think that's what you want. The other thing I wanted to mention, Commissioner Sturts made reference to a number of resolutions that were presented to the commission by cities and towns in eastern Arizona. I wanted to make it clear, and I have posted on my blog on November 16th about this. Those resolutions were largely obtained under false pretense by a person that is not registered to vote, and when he was asked by city and town councils about his registration, he said he was registered with neither party, but he didn't tell them that he is not registered to vote, and the reason he's not registered to vote is he's a convicted felon and has not had his civil rights restored. As such, I spoke with him at length. I determined that he was acting on the behest of and as an agent of the LD5 incumbent lawmakers who are referred to in eastern Arizona newspapers as the ABC team. Senator Allen is the A, then Representatives Brenda Barton and Chester Crandall are the B and the C. And as such, they were interfering with this process by deceptively using that young man as an instrument without full disclosure to the city and town councils. So with those resolutions, I think they should be taken with that perspective in mind. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Leonard Gorman, Executive Director, Navajo Nation Human Rights Commission.
Definitely short. Good afternoon, commissioners and folks participating and viewing the presentations by the internet. I want to have an opportunity to distribute some documents to the commissioners because of the point that we raised yesterday in our comments and the response that have been given with regards to the Legislative District 6 that's being suggested for review along the lines of making some swaps in Winslow area and also Sholo area, and what the impact that will be with regards to the Voting Rights Act concerns. But before I get to that area of discussion, I want to distribute some information I think that clearly illustrates the point that we're raising from the Navajo Nation with regards to the voter effectiveness or the ineffectiveness of voters on the Navajo Nation. I don't know if anybody could help me distribute two sets of documents that I want to provide, and I'll go through them at each point. The document that's being provided to you illustrates a location on Highway 191 between Chinle, Arizona and Ganado, Arizona on the Navajo Nation. And you will see a precinct, some precinct lines. First set of precinct lines are the blue lines, the dark blue lines. Those are the state precinct lines. Those are the ones that are used by the counties. Second precinct lines are the green lines. Those are the green lines are the ones that are used by the Navajo Nation during election times. So you'll see the shaded area in the middle of the page, in which it's noted that there are 29 voting age Navajo residents in this area who vote at Salina Cottonwood chapter for Navajo elections, while they vote at the Nazlini chapter for state election. So you'll see the distance between Cottonwood on the far upper left-hand corner of the map to the Nazlini chapter place. It is approximately an hour and 20 minutes. So the conditions that exist in this area, for example, is a Navajo person that lives in that shaded area would have to go to Nazlini and then canvass across to Cottonwood to cast both the Navajo Nation and the state election. Similarly, I want to also illustrate to you again, and I think this is primarily speaking to the U.S. Department of Justice, and since in your submission they will be reviewing your proposal to the U.S. Department of Justice, and how it's very complicated for a Navajo voter to participate in this whole process. Now, the second set, the next map that I'm providing to you illustrates a similar situation on a Navajo Nation. In this case, it's in Navajo County, on the northern part of Navajo County. The locations of reference are Kayenta, Arizona, Chichimbito, Arizona, and also Shanto, Arizona. And then the shaded area is where there are 75 voting age Navajo residents, and they vote for Navajo elections at Chichimbito Chapter House, which is on the right side of the map. And you see the dotted line that connects to Shanto. For the state election, they have to go to Shanto Chapter. So a distance between Shanto and Chichimbito is an hour-and-a-half drive one way. So you can imagine a person that lives in that shaded area having to travel to Shanto and also Chichimbito, two different places, polling places to cast votes for state and Navajo Nation election. This is not at the fault of the Navajo Nation. This is, I think, something that can be addressed by the state of Arizona, the counties, in which they align the precinct lines with the Navajo political boundaries. And you would not be putting Navajo voters in these dire conditions. So these two are prime examples, and you can just look at the maps that I've given you where the precinct lines don't coincide. There are gaps in between. So it's relatively confusing, even myself as a Navajo person that votes on the Navajo Nation state elections, looking at these maps, which direction does the voter travel to cast ballots for Navajo and state election? So you have to take that into consideration. This is a 2 to 5% issue in Native American voting age population for the Navajo people when you take into consideration Legislative District 7 at the present time. So turning to the concern about making some possible adjustments, reviews that would be made on Winslow and Sholo. Navajo Nation, along with the Hopi Nation, have made presentations that not only that there are culturally significant, historically used, traditionally used land areas, but also surrounding the Winslow area. Navajo Nation has lands to the northwest, to the northeast of Winslow. In the city of Winslow, there's a substantial number of Navajos that live in that community. Those Navajos that live there often are not there because of their choice. They're there because of the forced relocation activity that has been implemented by the federal government. They find themselves in those communities because they could not find any other residents on the Navajo Nation, or they're being forced off the Navajo Nation to live elsewhere. So there are a number of Navajos in that area. Navajo Nation has very, very strong concerns about how those numbers are going to be juggled around for the sake of trying to accommodate other concerns. Now, the Hopi Nation has also raised very, very strong concerns and made recommendations that the land areas that they have repurchased, which is south of Winslow, Winslow is actually enclosed by these conditions that I'm describing. And we have spoken to the city of Winslow, people from Winslow, when we're dealing with the Navajo County district boundaries, have made iteration to the Navajo County Commission that they feel very comfortable with being in a district in which Navajo Nation is located. because of the commerce activities, because of the community of interest concerns that the residents in the town have with the Navajo Nation. So that's a record in the Navajo County's redistricting activities. Now, should you decide to add Sholo to Legislative District 7, you will easily run into a situation in which you will be lowering the Native American voting age population from the current 61.9% to probably as low as 55%. So as speaking to the U.S. Department of Justice, we have very, very strong concerns about that type of iteration. So as I've explained to you just now, with the maps clearly illustrating the condition that exists on the Navajo Nation, these are not isolated situations on the Navajo Nation. This is a riddle throughout the Navajo Nation, not only in Arizona, New Mexico, but also Utah side. The state governments do not respect Navajo political boundaries, and that's one of the most difficult situations that Navajo voters face during election day. So hope that we would be able to have you understand and be more educated about choices that you will be making in the near future with regards to Legislative District 7. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Lauren Bernali, representing Navajo Nation. Human Rights Commission, too? Am I getting that right? Is it Navajo Nation Human Rights Commission?
Yes, you are.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Lauren Bernali. That's spelled Lauren, L-A-U-R-E-N. Bernali as in boy, E-R-N-A-L-L-Y, hyphen long, L-O-N-G. I want to talk to you about voter effectiveness and how that relates to the presentation provided by Mr. Leonard Gorman. Voter effectiveness is a very important aspect of the Voters' Rights Act, as it protects and preserves the rights of indigenous voters who face environmental and social challenges that are not purposely developed or designed by the voter. It is important that the Arizona Independent Redistricting Commission understand conditions that make it difficult for Navajo voters to vote. I want to give you 3 practical issues that affect Navajo voters. First, Navajo voters living on the reservation lack physical addresses that has a ripple effect for Navajo voters. Roads on the Navajo Nation are not paved and do not have proper street addressings as you find in a city or town. Many Navajo voters identify their homesteads by sacred sites or cultural landmarks that are familiar within Navajo culture. As a result, many Navajos rely on post offices to receive mail, which are spread out across the Navajo reservation. This causes problems for Navajo voters. Let me give you some examples. For voter registration, the voter must draw where the voter lives on a voter registration application. We have found that registered voters are sometimes not assigned a voting precinct or not included on the voter rolls when they go to vote because the county does not know where or which precinct to put them in. This can result in individuals getting frustrated and not voting. The lack of physical addresses have also resulted in challenges to the certification of Navajo candidates for office. In 2008, there were challenges to a number of Navajo candidates because their petitions were signed by Navajo voters with post office addresses. Not all Navajo candidates were able to respond to the challenges and were left off the ballot. Second, Navajo voters go to the polls to vote on election day and do not vote by mail because postal services, postal delivery are not readily available. Checking mail daily is not a daily ritual. For many, getting to the nearest post office or a relative's home where your mail goes happens once or twice a month. There are very few voting locations on the reservation. We also have Navajo voters who require Navajo ballot translations. Mail-in ballots or early voting is not an adequate mechanism to engage a voter, especially a Navajo voter. Third and final point, the Navajo Nation is a vast area that encompasses 25,000 square miles spreading across into 4 states. Water, electricity, and sanitation are not readily available in more than half the homes on the Navajo Nation. Community and economic development is sparse. Rural Navajo residents must travel great distances into populated communities to purchase goods and services. For a voter that lives out in a rural area where roads can become impassable during harsh weather and gas is almost $1 higher a gallon than in a city, these barriers make it difficult for a voter to consider casting a vote on election day. In some instances, it takes almost all day and maybe 2 days for a voter to get out to vote and get back home. The Voter Rights Act recognizes that for indigenous peoples of this country, there are other considerations that should be taken into account when you start to draw your voting lines. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Patty Ferguson Boney, attorney for Navajo Nation.
Good afternoon. My name is Patty Ferguson Bonnie, Patty Ferguson-Bohnee, and I'm an attorney representing the Navajo Nation. I would like to thank the Commission for their efforts in drafting an effective majority-minority Native American Legislative District, LD7, and would like to express to you that the Navajo Nation is interested in maintaining the current configuration of LD7 unless there are enhancements to the Native American voting age population. Also, on behalf of the nation, I would like to make a few comments regarding LD7 in response to the request made by Coconino County to remove the Schultz Fire area of Fernwood and Timberline from LD7. First, the nation is concerned with removing this area from LD7 for the following reasons. The Navajo Nation currently has lease land in LD7, and by removing the Schultz Fire or flood area from this location, it would divide the Navajo Nation leased land into 2 separate districts. The Navajo Nation also has ancestral land in this area, and because of this, the leased land and the ancestral land, the Navajo Nation is also has an interest in the response and mitigation efforts in this area. This area is working together with Coconino County, and we do not believe that its mission will change with respect to the prevention plans that it's working towards with the flood district. We believe that it will be the same whether it's in LD7 or another legislative district, because this is primarily a federal issue. The county has done a lot of advocacy with the federal government, all branches of the government, the legislative, the White House, and also the agencies. With any federal emergency area, there are a number of federal issues, and so we believe that this is an important consideration. They have been working with federal agencies such as FEMA, the Forest Service, and the Corps of Engineers, and their issues with national flood insurance. We've also been working with our U.S. senators and congressmen on federal legislation, such as the Burned Area Flood Prevention Act of 2011. While we do recognize that this area has a concern of interest together, we would ask that you consider the nation's request to maintain a high Native American voting age population and to not decrease the Native American voting age population if by removing this area is replaced by another population that would decrease the Native American voting age population. Thank you.
Thank you. That was my last request to speak form. Are there any other folks that would like to address the commission? Okay, well, thank you all for coming today and providing your input and participating in the process. I think that leaves, is there anything else that we needed to address? Okay. That leaves adjournment, and the time is 4:08 p.m. Oh, I haven't banged the gavel yet, so, okay. Herrera called, and he's apparently watching the video streaming. And on the record, he asked if we could extend an invitation to the Democratic leaders to come and present their report. That was the minority report from the legislature that we have a written copy of. And since the other group is going to be coming next week to present, he'd like us to also extend it to the minority. So, do we need to discuss that in any way? Is there any comments from commissioners? Mr. Sturts?
I think that when I spoke of this earlier, that I actually had included the minority report as making an outreach to them as well. So
great.
If I didn't make that clear, I think I stumbled over the Arizona minority report as well as the majority report to come over and make presentations to us.
Great. So we'll extend an offer to them to come and do that next week as well. So with that, the time is 4:09 p.m. and this meeting is adjourned. Thank you.